America is probably one of the few countries that really developed in a vacuum according to its own rules. All of Europe was somehow tossed between the Roman and Anglo-Saxon systems of government. But when America gained its independence, it created its own, which gave birth to a whole mountain of myths, interesting professions, and a whole lifestyle now called the American Dream. One of these details of the unique system were the bounty hunters, people whose job to this day is to find criminals and bring them to justice. It sounds strange to any European, and it's a matter of figuring out whether bounty hunters are a flaw in the system or an advantage. The best way to do this is to dive into history and live a day in the skin of a classic 19th century bounty hunter. In the next couple of minutes, we'll catch criminals, learn about the US justice system, and understand where the famous wanted posters come from. It will be really interesting. This video is brought to you by Thorum. Take a look at these rings. They have rings made from 4-billion-year-old Gibeon meteorite and genuine 65-million-year-old T-Rex bone. If you are a fan of Vikings, they have Odin ring, the Norse god of war, the Thor ring, and all of them are crafted by hand. Head the link in the comments and use promo code LIVINGHISTORY to get 20% off a truly unique ring. Well, our guest today is Matthew Inzero. The year is 1875, and our Matthew is the sheriff of the town of Lincoln, New Mexico. This will come as a first surprise to many, but sheriffs really could be bounty hunters. In fact, so could absolutely anyone. Anyone who saw a wanted poster for someone could get up, pull out their rifle, and go on a manhunt for a reward. And it's not just about the past. Even now in many states in the US, bounty hunters don't need a license, just permission from the person or organization who is looking for someone. In the 19th century, there was even more freedom, because in 1836, Colonel Colt invented the revolver, and, as you know, made citizens equal. Our Matthew, being the sheriff, is perfect for the job. After all, by law, he doesn't even have to take off his star while on a bounty hunt. And people are eager to share information about criminals when they see a man in uniform. Inzero has a mountain of assignments of varying complexity under his belt, as there was no clear definition of the occupation of a bounty hunter at the time. It's all about the difference between the American legal system and the Roman one. In Roman law, which was in force and remains in force throughout Europe, to search for someone requires a court decision, and the search must be handled by the competent services. American law, being the successor of Anglo-Saxon law, lacks this detail. Anyone could be wanted for any reason. A neighbor stole your life savings and went to another state? No going to the police. Hang up a reward notice and the fugitive's life gets a lot more complicated. That's where the very wanted dead or alive that Hollywood romanticized takes its roots. There really were a lot of posters like that around the US before it became independent. It's true that about half of them weren't hung on poles, but wanted posters were often published in newspapers. Inzero reads the newspapers with his morning coffee in search of work, for the position of sheriff in the small town of Lincoln is not a dusty one. Everyone knows each other, everyone's got a revolver, and the hotheads have long since been eliminated in kind. Matthew devotes his free time to hunting people. A couple of years ago, Inzero, while having his morning coffee, saw an ad for the 3 Espinosa brothers who killed 30 people in Colorado. Matthew packed his backpack, unpacked his rifle, and headed to Mexico, where he bumped off all 3, brought their heads back to the US, and received a respectable $500 reward. That's about $40,000 in today's money. That's a lot of money. So now Inzero is looking at the very busy search section of the county paper. Our Matthew is a good guy and doesn't take on murky ads, and there have been plenty of those. Often, those who wanted to find someone alive or dead didn't even bother with the details of the person's misdeeds. They just put a bigger price tag. Many hotheads have also taken to this, but our Inzero understands that killing an innocent person can get you in trouble for a long time. Contrary to Hollywood, killing an innocent person in the US in the 19th century was severely punished. So Matthew mostly works on ads issued by the government or large corporations. For example, he is now interested in an ad from Albuquerque, where local official Michelle Blatter was caught up in corruption, but escaped. More specifically, he was first released on bail, but the guy didn't show up for court by the date set. Spoiler alert. This is what modern bounty hunters do most often. But the roots of the occupation go back not even 200 years, but much more. For the practice of bail was widely used as early as the 13th century. For example, in England, a person who had committed a crime could be released from prison for the duration of the trial under the guarantee of a relative. If the person did not return to court, his place on the bench was taken by a relative who had signed. Later, such a bond was replaced by a monetary bond. There even appeared special funds that issued bail money, but it is logical that many criminals used this opportunity to escape. For example, in today's US, about 20% of people out on bail don't show up in court, so both 13th century England and our Matthew Inzero's America needed people capable of finding and bringing such guys to justice. What happens when Inzero decides to take on a contract? It's very simple. Matthew will pack his bags and go to Albuquerque on his horse. There, he will meet with the officials who have advertised, learn from them the details of the crime, the details of the man's life, the size of the reward, and if he is satisfied with everything, he will get to work. With 99% probability, the details of the contract will suit Inzero because the market is free, and everyone understands that the low price of a reward will not lure a good specialist to the case. Most often, and to this day, uses the percentage scheme. That is, a reward for the head is assigned a figure in the 10-20% of the debt of the person. Thus, both the clients and the bounty hunter are in the money. After all, our Matthew is not only interesting, but also safe. In 1873, as a result of the case of Taylor versus Taintor, bounty hunters were officially recognized as representatives of the law and given the right to arrest wanted people. That is to say, once a manhunt was concluded, anyone, whether a sheriff or an ordinary logger, was given the legal right to arrest, normally available only to the legal police, and at the same time, the right to violate the private property of the wanted man. The bounty hunter system, due to its logicality, has survived for so many centuries and remains relevant to this day. On the one hand, people earn money, and on the other hand, justice prevails and is not bogged down in bureaucracy. But of course, catching the man is not easy, and any passerby would be unlikely to complete the operation successfully. Our Inzero, in addition to being a sheriff, is quite a good bounty hunter. Most of the time, hunters entered the profession because of their tracking skills and patience. The other half were detectives, or just people with the right mindset and shooting skills. After all, you wouldn't think a criminal on the run would happily surrender to the mercy of a hunter, would you? Our Matthew knows this and is therefore a successful bounty hunter. Inzero knows that there's no room for heroism in his profession and prefers to track down his victims and apprehend them in the dark and by the easiest possible means, like a handkerchief with chloroform or a banal bullet in the back, if the contract allows for it. But the funny thing is that neither Matthew nor his colleagues call themselves bounty hunters as such. The term bounty hunter existed for a couple of hundred years, but it meant something else entirely. Usually, bounty hunter was a term for people catching wild animals for a fee. In the past, the term bounty meant a reward for service or length of service in the army. The fact is that the word itself comes from the French language, in which it means something good and pleasant. The word reward was attached to the word bounty much later. Well, the members of our Matthew's profession first started calling themselves bounty hunters in the movies of the 50s of the 20th century. And it was after their success that members of the profession adopted the pseudonym. So our Matthew, like the other guys in 1875, does not call himself a bounty hunter, thief hunter, bail bondsman, or just hunter. Those we call bounty hunters most often called themselves like that, and they didn't like to stick their necks out. There weren't many pictures back then, but it was still silly to go out hunting when the perpetrator knew you by sight. Our Matthew came up with a pseudonym, The Hammer, under which he usually asked to be published in the newspaper about the capture of another criminal. It is standard practice and banal security. Detainees could always have friends on the loose, and it would be awkward to give them your name and place of residence on a platter. So Inzero, going in search of the wanted fugitive Johnson, will proceed with the utmost caution. In a sheriff's suit with a star, it is better to ask people indirect and vague questions, so that even they will not guess who exactly Matthew is looking for. Well, when it comes to catching a good bounty hunter, won't look like his prototype from the movie Shooting from a Horse on the Move. Most likely, our Inzero will look like a ninja who will hit Johnson with something heavy at night in a back alley, and drive him out of town at night to pick up his reward in Albuquerque. Its size was very different. If in England the famous John the Priest Hunter was getting £100 per head, then the relatively modern Domino Harvey was getting about $40,000 a year, working for Los Angeles in the 90s. Because of inflation, it's hard to talk about the amounts, but one thing's for sure. The average of the $200, $300 price tags our Matthew was getting per head was enough for a pretty well-fed life. Actually, for $9 in the 19th century, you could send 2,000 pounds of cargo from Europe to the US, and for $500 to buy not just a house, but a luxury mansion. So the profession of Inzero, though dangerous, is very profitable. The same fireman in Massachusetts in 1875 was paid $1.50 a day. That is to say, our Matthew could earn his year's wages in just one trip. Of course, there were smaller hunters. Of course, not all were successful, and half of them died on their first missions. And of course, not all bounty hunters were good guys. Most simply used power to fulfill a desire for violence and easy money. But that's the beauty of the elegant U.S. justice scheme. It was all for the greater good. Criminals went to jail, and the Treasury, with the help of the guys, recovered the lost money. Bounty hunters in the U.S. are still recovering it now, but now you learn that today's guys have little in common with their historical ancestors. Even the name of the profession is taken from the movies, and Moors are very different these days. That's all for now. And if you want to hear more stories about the Wild West, leave your demands in the comments. See you soon, folks.